the night settles, and we journey back more than 2,000 years to a land of marble halls, olive groves, and distant thunder carried on the wind. In Macedon, a prince was born beneath omens that whispered of destiny. His name was Alexander, a boy who would one day ride farther than any before him, carrying both dreams and burdens into the heart of the known world. Close your eyes and imagine the glow of torches flickering against stone walls, the murmur of scholars, and the rustle of banners caught in the breeze. This is not only the tale of conquest, but of vision, longing, and the fleeting nature of glory. What do you think Alexander dreamed of as a child? The quiet life of a prince, or the endless horizons beyond the mountains? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. And if you enjoy sleep stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Now let the air grow still and step softly into the story of his birth. The night in Macedon was heavy with expectation. The summer air carried the smell of pine resin and hearth smoke, and in the palace of Pella, the queen paced quietly, her breath slow and measured. Olympias, wife of King Philip II, had been told by seers that her child would be unlike any other. A son whose fate would ripple far beyond the borders of Macedon. Some whispered of dreams where thunder rolled across the heavens. Others spoke of serpents curling protectively around her bed. The old stories lived like a shadow over the halls, and in the hush of that night, a cry soon echoed. The cry of a newborn boy. The infant's name was Alexander, protector of men. To those gathered, it was an ordinary birth in an extraordinary time. To the priests and soothsayers, however, signs accompanied his arrival. They told of blazing fires seen on distant hills, and of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, said to have burned on the very night he was born. To the Greeks, such omens could not be ignored. They were threads in a tapestry woven by the gods themselves, hinting at a destiny vast and uncontainable. Imagine for a moment the palace where he took his first breaths. The air cool against stone pillars, walls painted with bright scenes of hunting and battle. Servants padded softly through the corridors, carrying bowls of olive oil, honey, and wine. Outside, horses whinnied in their stables, their breath steaming in the dawn. Macedon was a rugged land, shaped by mountains, forests, and rivers, its people proud and restless. The boy born that night would grow up not in quiet luxury, but amid the rhythms of a kingdom that was both young and fiercely ambitious. King Philip, Alexander's father, was no ordinary ruler. He was a warrior of cunning mind who had forged Macedon into a rising power. Through diplomacy, marriage, and ruthless skill, Philip had united a land once fractured by rival clans. He had reshaped his army, teaching them to fight in long, disciplined phalanxes with spears that stretched farther than those of their enemies. His ambitions did not end at the borders of Macedon. He looked toward the Greek city-states and beyond, to the great Persian Empire. When he gazed upon his son, Philip saw more than a child. He saw a potential heir to dreams even he might not live to fulfill. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was equally formidable. She was said to be devoted, fiery, and deeply spiritual, practicing rituals that drew whispers from courtiers and scholars alike. In her arms, Alexander was not only a prince, but a child touched by divine promise. She told him stories of heroes, of Achilles who raged across Troy, of gods who walk the earth, of kings who carried both glory and burden. These tales were not simply entertainments, they were seeds planted in the boy's imagination, shaping the way he would see himself and the world. Can you picture the young Alexander in those early years? A child running barefoot across marble courtyards, the cool stone underfoot, his small hands reaching to touch the manes of horses, his eyes wide as he listened to the clash of spears in the training fields. Around him, Macedon bustled, craftsmen shaping bronze, women grinding grain, children chasing each other through narrow streets where the scent of bread and olives lingered in the air. The kingdom was alive, and within it, the boy grew restless and curious. Stories tell us Alexander was unlike other children. He was quick to anger, fiercely competitive, and endlessly determined. One tale speaks of his famous horse, Bucephalus. When Alexander was just a boy, the great horse was brought before Philip. None could tame it. The animal reared and fought, throwing off every rider. But young Alexander noticed something others missed, that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Leading Bucephalus gently toward the sun so the shadow fell behind, Alexander mounted him with calm and confidence. The horse accepted him, and from that day, boy and animal were bound together. Philip, watching in awe, is said to have turned to his companions and whispered, "Macedon is too small for my son. He must seek a kingdom greater than this." Moments like these filled Alexander's childhood with quiet echoes of greatness. Yet, for all the omens and stories, he was still a child. He played with friends, wrestled in the dust, and learned to read and recite poetry. His education was not ordinary. Philip secured for him one of the greatest teachers of the age, Aristotle, the philosopher whose words would guide generations. Under the shade of trees, Aristotle spoke to Alexander of nature, ethics, politics, and the vastness of the world. He taught him to question, to observe, to seek knowledge beyond what eyes could see. Can you imagine sitting there, hearing the murmur of the philosopher's voice, the pages of scrolls rustling in the breeze, the young prince's gaze fixed with curiosity? Aristotle gave Alexander more than knowledge. He instilled in him a sense of wonder, a belief that the world was wide and waiting to be discovered. From him, Alexander inherited not only the strategies of governance, but also a thirst for understanding different peoples, lands, and ideas. This thirst would later carry him farther than any Greek had ever gone. The people of Macedon, too, shaped him. They were hardy, used to the roughness of the land and the unpredictability of war. To be a king in Macedon was not to sit idly on a throne, but to ride at the head of armies, to eat the same food as one's soldiers, to endure hardship alongside them. As Alexander grew, he absorbed this ethos. He learned that leadership was not just command, but shared struggle. At night, the palace grew quiet. Oil lamps flickered, casting golden pools of light across the stone floors. Outside, cicadas sang in the trees, and the cool mountain winds swept through the halls. In such moments, one might picture the boy lying awake, listening to the night, dreaming of distant horizons. Did he see in his mind's eye the deserts of Persia, the rivers of India, the mountains beyond the known world? Or was he simply a boy, drifting into sleep, lulled by the sounds of home? Prophecies, parents, and philosophers surrounded his early life with expectation. Every step seemed to lead him towards something greater, though the path was still hidden. What we know is that in those tender years, Alexander carried within him the restless spirit of a seeker. a child shaped by the love of his mother, the discipline of his father, the wisdom of his teacher, and the land of Macedon itself. The story of Alexander begins not with the clash of armies or the founding of cities, but here, in the small, human moments of his early life. A boy who learned to ride, to listen, to question, and to dream. A boy who would one day change the world. And so the child of prophecy grew, stepping each day closer to the man history would remember as the Great. The boy who would one day be called Alexander the Great did not grow up solely on stories of prophecy and omens. His mind was nourished by words, ideas, and visions of a world beyond Macedon's mountains. When he was still young, his father Philip sought to give him the finest education possible. For a son who might inherit an empire, only the greatest teacher would suffice. And so, into the life of the restless child stepped one of the most brilliant minds of the ancient world, Aristotle. Imagine the quiet of a summer morning in Macedon. The cicadas hum among the olive branches, their sound steady as a heartbeat. The air is scented with herbs crushed beneath sandals, the sharp fragrance of thyme and rosemary drifting in the breeze. Beneath the canopy of trees, a group gathers in the dappled light. Scrolls are unfurled across wooden tables, ink pots glimmer in the sun, and young boys lean forward, their faces eager. At the center sits Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, thinker, and beside him, the young Prince Alexander, eyes alert, his mind hungry for the world that lay beyond the horizon. Aristotle did not merely teach facts, he opened windows. He spoke of the natural world, of how plants grow and change, of the stars scattered like silver dust across the night sky. He spoke of politics, of how cities rise and fall, of how men govern one another, and what justice might mean. He spoke of the soul, of virtue, of balance, ideas that might seem abstract, yet for a boy destined to lead, were threads woven into the fabric of character. Alexander listened. His memory was sharp, his curiosity boundless. He asked questions not only of what, but of why. Why do people follow leaders? Why do empires collapse? Why do men risk their lives for glory? Such questions were not easily answered, yet in the dialogue between teacher and student, a foundation was laid. One that would carry Alexander across deserts, mountains, and rivers still unseen. Aristotle also gave to Alexander a gift more personal, a deep love for Homer's Iliad. The epic of Troy, of Achilles and Hector, of gods and men locked in eternal struggle. This was no mere tale for Alexander, it was a mirror in which he saw himself. Achilles, swift-footed, fearless, but fated to a short life of glory, rather than a long life of quiet. This was the figure Alexander admired most. He kept a copy of the Iliad with him always, annotated by Aristotle's own hand, as if the words were not just literature, but a guide to life. Can you picture him there, the boy king in the making, sitting cross-legged on the cool stone floor of his chamber, the lamplight flickering across the parchment, lips moving silently as he traced the lines of Homer? Outside, the wind rustled the vines, and somewhere in the dark a dog barked. Yet within those words, he wandered far, across the plains of Troy, through the clash of spears, alongside heroes whose names would echo for centuries. But Alexander's education did not end with poetry and philosophy. Aristotle taught him the sciences, medicine, biology, and geography. He encouraged him to observe the world carefully. When a leaf curled under the sun, what caused it? When men fell ill, what healed them? When stars wheeled overhead, What patterns guided their return? Alexander absorbed it all, not as dry lessons, but as keys to understanding the world he longed to explore. There is something soothing in the thought of those lessons. Imagine a young boy bent over a clay tablet, scratching letters with a stylus, while the soft murmur of Aristotle's voice floats through the grove. The breeze lifts the edge of a parchment scroll. The smell of ink mingles with the scent of crushed grass. And in the distance, horses whicker from their stalls. Knowledge here was not harsh or forced. It was as natural as breath, a rhythm of curiosity and discovery that calmed the restless energy of the prince. And yet, Alexander was never only a scholar. Between lessons, he trained with weapons, rode horses, hunted in the hills, and wrestled with companions. His education was balanced, blending the mind of a philosopher with the body of a warrior. Perhaps this harmony was what gave him such presence in later years. He was not merely a fighter, nor only a thinker, but both at once. Aristotle's influence extended even further. He taught Alexander to look beyond Greece and Macedon, to see the world as a tapestry of cultures and peoples. He spoke of distant India, of lands where elephants roamed, of rivers wider than any in Greece, of strange animals and plants unknown to the Macedonians. He planted in Alexander's heart a hunger, not only to conquer, but to know, to see, to learn, to bring back to Greece the wonders of other lands. At times the boy would wander alone after lessons, his mind full of new thoughts. He might pause by the banks of a river, watching the water flow over smooth stones, and think of Heraclitus's words. No man ever steps in the same river twice. Did Alexander even then sense the fleeting nature of all things? Did he know that one day, like the heroes he admired, his life would blaze bright and brief? Olympias, his mother, watched with pride. She saw not only her son's quickness of mind, but the destiny that seemed to wrap around him like a cloak. Philip, his father too, saw it, though his pride was mixed with a certain wariness. For Philip was a king of earth and spear, of strategy and battlefield. He valued philosophy, yes, but he also knew that empires were not won with words alone. Perhaps in quiet moments he wondered, would this boy one day surpass him? Would the son eclipse the father? As seasons turned, Alexander grew. His mind sharpened, his body strengthened. The olive groves that once seemed vast became familiar paths. Scrolls that once puzzled him grew clear in meaning. The Iliad's verses became his constant companion. The teacher's voice and the student's determination wove together into something rare. A prince who was more than royal blood, who was more than military promise. A prince who understood that the world was both fragile and immense, and that within him burned a spark to shape it. At night, after long days of training and study, Alexander must have lain beneath the dark skies of Macedon. The stars spread wide and infinite above him. Did he whisper to himself lines of Homer? Did he imagine leading armies across distant deserts? Or did he, for a moment, simply rest in the comfort of youth, a boy with dreams, not yet a man burdened by destiny? This was the Alexander of his early years, inquisitive, restless, nurtured by a philosopher's wisdom, guided by stories of heroes, inspired by lands he had not yet seen. The olive groves of Macedon cradled a child whose footsteps would one day echo across continents. And so, under the patient gaze of Aristotle, the boy grew not only in knowledge, but in vision. The world seemed vast, yet somehow within reach. With every lesson, every scroll, every verse of Homer, the horizon stretched a little farther, calling him toward the life that awaited. The olive groves of Macedon were no longer enough to contain the boy who had once listened so eagerly at Aristotle's side. Alexander was growing taller, his shoulders broadening, his gaze sharpening. He was still a youth, yet already he carried himself with a presence that made others pause. His voice was clear, his stride firm, and his mind, sharpened by both philosophy and ambition, sought the chance to prove itself not only in thought but in action. Philip II, his father, was a man of endless campaigns. Rarely did a season pass without armies marching, without riders vanishing into the dust of the horizon. Macedon was surrounded by rivals, restless city-states, wild tribes from the north, and shifting alliances that could fracture with the turn of a season. For a young prince, this was the forge in which character was tested. And Alexander, eager as the dawn, longed for the fire of battle. One of his earliest trials came when Philip marched to campaign and left the kingdom in his son's care. Alexander was not yet a man, scarcely more than 16, when responsibility fell upon him. The palace that had been a place of learning and dreams now echoed with the weight of command. Imagine the torchlight flickering against maps stretched across wooden tables, the smell of wax and parchment mingling with the faint tang of steel. The boy listened to reports from generals twice his age, voices rough from years of war, and he answered with clarity, his decisions measured, his confidence steady. It was not long before his courage was tested beyond counsel. A tribe from Thrace rose in defiance, threatening the Macedonian frontier. Alexander, young though he was, did not hesitate. He gathered men, mounted Bucephalus, and rode north. Picture him there, the golden dust of the road rising around his horse's hooves, the soldiers looking at their prince with curiosity, perhaps doubt. Could one so young truly lead them? Yet in his bearing there was no uncertainty. His posture was straight, his eyes fixed ahead, and in his voice there was no hesitation. The battle that followed was fierce but swift. Macedonian spears held their line, the discipline of Philip's army unyielding. Alexander, in the midst of it, showed not the caution of youth, but the sharpness of instinct. He moved quickly, striking at the weak points, rallying his men with the clarity of command. When the enemy broke, it was the young prince who pursued, pressing forward until victory was certain. For the soldiers, that day changed everything. No longer was Alexander only the boy who studied with philosophers or the son of the king. He had proven himself in the dust and the clash of arms. Around campfires that night, as bread was broken and wine poured, stories of his courage were whispered. A prince had shown the heart of a lion. Philip himself heard of the victory and felt pride swell within him. Yet perhaps too he felt the stirrings of something more complex, the recognition that his son might not only inherit his legacy, but surpass it. A father's pride, mingled with a warrior's unease. Beyond this first victory, other tests came swiftly. In the games and competitions of Macedon, Alexander sought always to excel. He wrestled, raced, hunted, never content with second place, always striving for more. His companions, boys of noble families who grew up at his side, knew both the fire of his temper and the depth of his loyalty. To stand beside Alexander was to be drawn into the force of his ambition. He inspired not only obedience but devotion. One story tells of a time in battle when Alexander's helmet was struck, and blood ran down his face. Rather than retreat, he pressed forward harder, his men rallying to him as if his courage burned brighter in danger. He was not reckless, but neither did he shrink from risk. He understood, even in youth, that a leader must be seen at the front, must share the same dangers as those who followed him. Can you imagine the sight? A teenage prince, the sun flashing on his bronze armor, his cloak streaming behind him as Bucephalus surged forward. Dust swirled, shouts echoed, and the boy who once traced verses of Homer now lived them, embodying the heroism he so admired. The Iliad was no longer only words on a page. It was a script he sought to write with his own deeds. There were quieter moments too, in between the battles and the duties of command. Evenings when the army rested, when the fire crackled and smoke curled upward into the night. Soldiers murmured tales of home, of fields and families. Alexander listened, not with the distance of royalty, but with the closeness of one who shared their trials. He ate the same bread, drank from the same cups. In these moments, bonds were forged, the kind that would one day carry his men across impossible distances. Philip, observing his son's growth, began to entrust him with greater roles. He allowed him to sit in councils, to debate strategy, to learn the weaving of alliances and the unraveling of intrigue. Alexander absorbed it all. He was still young, but already he carried himself with the weight of destiny, as if he knew his path would stretch beyond the borders of Macedon. And yet, beneath the armor and ambition, he was still a youth. There must have been nights when he returned to his chamber, weary from training, his body sore from riding and combat. Perhaps he lay on his bed of woven linen, the smell of olive oil lamps drifting through the air, and felt both exhilaration and exhaustion. A boy with dreams too large for his frame, straining toward a horizon he could not yet reach. The soldiers began to call him not only prince, but commander. The respect of men seasoned by battle was not easily won, yet Alexander earned it through courage, quickness of thought, and a willingness to share in hardship. The first seeds of loyalty were sown, seeds that would grow into devotion strong enough to carry armies through deserts, mountains, and storms yet to come. In the quiet of these early victories, Alexander's path began to take shape. He was no longer merely a student of Aristotle, no longer simply the son of Philip and Olympias. He was becoming himself, a young lion, restless and unafraid, whose roar was just beginning to be heard. The dawn of greatness does not always arrive in thunder. Sometimes it comes in the dust of a frontier skirmish, in the determined gaze of a boy on horseback, in the steady trust of soldiers who look to him and see a leader. For Alexander, these early battles were more than victories. They were affirmations that his destiny was real, that the omens of his birth had spoken true, that the fire within him would not be easily contained. And so, in the hills of Macedon and the frontiers of Thrace, the world first caught a glimpse of the man he would become. The boy was fading, the youth transforming, and the lion within was stirring, ready to stride into history. The kingdom of Macedon had been built on the shoulders of a single man's vision. King Philip II, father of Alexander, was no ordinary ruler. In less than 2 decades, he had transformed Macedon from a scattered, struggling land into the strongest military power in Greece. His armies marched in unbroken lines, his cavalry struck with the weight of thunder, and one by one, the proud city-states of Greece bent to his authority. In the bustling palace of Pella, the air often hummed with the voices of ambassadors and generals. Marble floors echoed with the footsteps of messengers, bringing tidings from far corners of the land. Banners fluttered in the courtyards, their bright colours catching the sun. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine drifted from the banquet halls, where Philip entertained allies and monitored rivals. Macedon had become a court of splendour, but also of intrigue, where loyalty and suspicion walked side by side. For Alexander, still in the bloom of youth, his father was both model and shadow. He admired Philip's brilliance as a general, but sometimes chafed beneath his presence. Philip had achieved so much, and yet his ambition grew larger still. His eyes turned eastward toward the Persian Empire, whose wealth and lands stretched farther than the imagination. It was Philip's dream to lead a united Greece across the sea, to challenge the great king of Persia. Plans were laid, armies gathered, alliances forged. The great campaign was nearly ready. But fate, so often present in the stories of Alexander, had its own design. The year was 336 BCE. A wedding was to be celebrated, not of Alexander, but of his sister, Cleopatra. The palace in Aegae, one of Macedon's oldest cities, was alive with festivity. Picture it: long rows of wooden tables laid with figs, cheese and honey cakes, amphorae of wine gleaming in the torchlight, garlands of green draped across pillars. Musicians plucked strings, the air filled with laughter, and dancers moved in rhythm to the beating of drums. Philip entered the celebration in triumph, a king at the height of his power. His cloak was purple, his crown gleamed in the torchlight. Soldiers and courtiers cheered, their voices rising like a wave. To many, it seemed nothing could shake Macedon's strength. Yet in moments of greatest confidence, the unexpected can strike. As Philip walked among the guests, a man stepped forward, one of his own bodyguards. With a sudden thrust, a blade found its mark. Gasps filled the hall, music faltered, wine spilled across the stone. The king of Macedon fell, struck down not by a foreign enemy, but by a hand from within his own ranks. Imagine the silence that followed, heavy, disbelieving. Torches flickered, shadows danced wildly across the walls, and the laughter of moments before turned to murmurs of fear. A king was dead, and with him the future seemed uncertain. For Alexander, the moment was life-altering. He was just 20 years old, still on the threshold of manhood, when news of his father's death reached him. Grief struck him, but so too did urgency. Macedon was a land built on strength, and in the space of a heartbeat, that strength seemed fragile. Rivals whispered, factions stirred, and enemies beyond the borders watched with keen interest. Would the young prince falter? Would the kingdom splinter? The palace in those days must have been a place of tension. Stone corridors echoed with hurried footsteps, voices hushed in corners. Olympias, Alexander's mother, stood fiercely at her son's side, her presence as commanding as ever. She reminded him of his destiny, urged him to claim what was his. Around them, supporters gathered, soldiers loyal to Alexander's courage and promise. Yet not all were convinced. Power in Macedon was never passed without struggle. Alexander acted swiftly. He took the throne without hesitation, his bearing steady despite his youth. Standing before the army, he spoke not as a boy, but as a king. Imagine the scene, a sea of spears rising like a forest in the sunlight, the young man upon Bucephalus, his voice carrying over the ranks. He promised to lead as his father had, to honour Philip's vision, and to take Macedon forward into the campaign that had already been set in motion. His men, moved by both grief and loyalty, raised their voices in acclaim. The boy had become king. In the days that followed, Alexander secured his position with determination. Those who opposed him were silenced, either by persuasion or by force. He honoured his father's allies, but made it clear that he was no mere shadow of Philip. He was his own man, and he intended to rule not as a caretaker, but as a leader destined for greatness. Yet even as he took command, one can imagine the quiet weight upon his heart. In the stillness of the night, perhaps he sat alone in the palace, the oil lamp casting its glow across stone walls, the sound of distant winds slipping through the corridors. A son mourning his father, a youth thrust into the storm of kingship. Did he think of the lessons of Aristotle, of the verses of Homer, of Achilles, who too lost a father figure before stepping into destiny? Did he feel the mixture of sorrow and resolve that comes when life changes in an instant? The assassination of Philip left Macedon shaken, but Alexander's response steadied it. In the years to come, many would remember how swiftly he moved, how firmly he took hold of the reins of power. The world would soon learn that the young king was no ordinary heir. The death of Philip was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. For Alexander, it marked the end of youth and the beginning of a journey that would carry him farther than even his father had dreamed. The halls of Aegae still echoed with the memory of betrayal, but beyond them lay horizons waiting to be crossed. And so, from the shadow of tragedy, Alexander stepped forward, a young king with the fire of grief in his heart and the weight of destiny upon his shoulders. The lion cub had lost its protector. Now it would roar on its own. The sudden death of Philip II left Macedon trembling. A kingdom built on one man's brilliance seemed, for a moment, as fragile as a clay vessel struck by a careless hand. In the torchlit halls of Aegae, whispers spread like smoke. Some spoke of revenge, others of opportunity. Allies wondered if the bonds forged with Philip would hold under a youth's command. Enemies beyond the borders watched keenly, ready to strike at the smallest sign of weakness. And into this uncertainty stepped Alexander. He was just 20 years old, yet the weight of a kingdom rested upon his shoulders. The boy who once listened to Aristotle's lessons beneath the olive trees now faced a world demanding not philosophy, but action. In those first days, the air in the palace must have been heavy with tension. Picture the courtyards where soldiers gathered in restless clusters, their bronze helmets glinting in the sun. Imagine the murmurs of courtiers along marble corridors, their voices hushed, their eyes glancing toward the young man who now wore the crown. Was he strong enough? Would he falter? Could he carry on Philip's vision? Alexander wasted no time in answering. He called the Macedonian army together, the phalanxes of hardened warriors who had marched under Philip's banners for years. They filled the fields, rows upon rows of spears rising like a living forest. Mounted on Bucephalus, his cloak rippling in the breeze, Alexander faced them. His voice rang clear. He would not only continue his father's work, but surpass it. He swore to lead them, to share their hardships, to bring them victories greater than any they had yet known. The soldiers, stirred by his fire and steadiness, raised their spears and shouted their allegiance. The kingdom had found its king, but words alone could not secure a throne. Challenges rose swiftly, as they always do in moments of transition. Some Greek city-states saw Philip's death as a chance to break free. Thebes and Athens stirred, debating whether the yoke of Macedon might be thrown off, while its new ruler was still untested. To the north, Thracian tribes eyed Macedon's borders, wondering if the time had come to reclaim lost lands. Even within the kingdom, rivals whispered, some hoping to seize the crown for themselves. Alexander met each threat with decisive energy. He moved with a swiftness that stunned friend and foe alike. First, he silenced opposition at home, consolidating power within Macedon itself. Those who challenged him were dealt with firmly, some persuaded by loyalty, others by the edge of necessity. Olympias, his mother, stood as a fierce ally, ensuring that her son's claim remained unshaken among the nobility. Once his foundation was secured, Alexander turned outward. With an army at his back, he marched south into Greece, where murmurs of rebellion had begun. The sight of Macedonian spears, gleaming in the sunlight, was enough to remind the city-states of Philip's might, and of the fire in his son. At Corinth, Alexander reaffirmed the League of Greek states his father had formed, presenting himself not merely as a Macedonian king, but as commander of a united Greece. In council halls hung with bronze shields and painted frescoes, the Greeks bowed to necessity. Alexander would lead them. One by one, challenges fell silent. Thebes and Athens yielded to his authority. To the north, Thracians were pushed back, their raids suppressed by swift campaigns. Macedon's borders held firm, its heart secure. Within months, the doubts that had clouded his ascension cleared. The youth was king, not in name only, but in strength. Can you imagine the nights during that first year of kingship? The campfires burning beyond the city walls, soldiers murmuring as they sharpened their blades, the young king walking among them. He shared their food, listened to their stories, and let them see that he was not above them, but one of them, a leader willing to endure as they endured. By such small human acts, he bound men to him more surely than any decree. The world beyond began to take notice. Envoys from Persia, the vast empire to the east, heard of Philip's death and perhaps hoped Macedon would fall into disarray. Instead, they found the son as relentless as the father. To them, Alexander was still little more than a youth, but soon they would discover how swiftly a youth could become a conqueror. For Alexander, these days were both burden and awakening. He had mourned his father, but now he carried Philip's dream within him. The campaign against Persia, already planned, now became his own destiny. He spoke of it often, his eyes shining with the light of possibility. To his companions, the vision was intoxicating, a march beyond the sea, into lands rich with treasure, cities of gold and marble, horizons that stretched beyond imagination. And yet, beneath the vision, there must have been quiet moments of doubt. Alone in his chamber, perhaps by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, did Alexander wonder if he could live up to the shadow of Philip? Did he recall Aristotle's words about virtue and balance, and steady his heart with the lessons of philosophy? Did he open his copy of Homer's Iliad and trace the lines of Achilles, whispering to himself the destiny of a hero? The palace at Pella must have felt different in those days. Once it had echoed with Philip's voice, his stride across the marble floors. Now the halls belonged to Alexander. Courtiers bowed lower, servants moved swiftly at his command, and generals stood before him, awaiting his orders. The young king was learning the rhythms of rule, the weight of decisions, the endless demands, the careful balance between firmness and mercy. His companions, those who had grown up at his side, became his closest circle. Men like Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and Perdiccas, who had studied with him under Aristotle and trained with him in the fields, now stood as his trusted officers. Together they dreamed of the campaigns to come, their laughter and plans carrying late into the night. The kingdom, once trembling, began to breathe again. Macedon had not fallen into chaos. It had not fractured or faltered. Instead, it stood firm, held by the will of a king barely past youth. In the fields, soldiers trained, their shields flashing in the sun. In the cities, merchants carried on their trade, markets bustled, families tended to their homes. The rhythms of life continued, steadied by the presence of a ruler who had proven himself capable. It is a comforting thought that in a world so often uncertain, leadership can bring stability, that the courage of one can steady the hearts of many. Alexander, though only 20, carried that mantle with a grace beyond his years. And so, with Macedon secure, Greece united, and enemies held at bay, the stage was set for the dream Philip had left unfinished. The Persian Empire awaited, vast, rich, formidable. The great King Darius ruled over lands stretching from the Mediterranean to the mountains of India. To challenge such an empire seemed madness. Yet to Alexander, it was destiny. In the glow of firelight, perhaps he stood upon a hill, gazing eastward, the night wind tugging at his cloak. Behind him lay Macedon, safe and whole. Before him lay the unknown, the boundless. And within him burned the certainty that he would not only walk that road, he would master it. The young king had claimed his throne. Now he was ready to claim the world. The land of Macedon was calm, its borders guarded, its people steady. The Greek cities, once restless, had yielded again to Macedonian authority. The foundations of Alexander's power were secure, and yet his gaze did not linger on the hills of home. It stretched farther beyond the seas, toward the east, toward the empire of Persia. The Persian realm was immense, stretching from the shores of the Aegean across deserts, mountains, and rivers, all the way to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, and farther still into lands where the horizon dissolved into mystery. To the Greeks, Persia was both a rival and a wonder. Its palaces shone with gold, its roads connected cities across vast distances, and its armies were counted in the hundreds of thousands. To challenge such a power would have seemed impossible. And yet, it was this very impossibility that called to Alexander. The dream had not been born with him. It had been Philip's vision, to unite the Greek world and lead it against Persia. Philip's death had left the plan unfinished, but his son, with fire in his heart, took it as destiny. Alexander spoke often of vengeance for the old Persian wars, when Greek cities had burned, and of carrying Greek banners into Asia. But beyond vengeance, there was a deeper hunger. The lure of discovery, of horizons untrodden, of glory written on a scale no man had yet achieved. Imagine the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water dividing Europe from Asia. The sea glimmers in the morning sun, its surface touched with gold. The Macedonian army gathers along the coast. Tens of thousands of soldiers, their bronze helmets gleaming, their long spears stacked in rows. Horses stamp their hooves, ships creak against the tide, and the air hums with the murmur of voices. Before the crossing, Alexander performed sacred rites. A sacrifice was made, the scent of burning offerings rising into the wind, prayers carried to the gods of Greece. He knew that to embark on such a journey was not only to test men and armies, but to step into the realm of fate. The soldiers, watching their young king, felt both awe and reassurance. He moved with calm, as if destiny itself guided his steps. When the time came, Alexander was among the first to cross. The waters of the Hellespont shimmered beneath him as he sailed toward Asia. Upon reaching the far shore, he leapt to the ground and performed an ancient ritual. He cast his spear into the soil, claiming the land as won by conquest. To him, this was not merely a symbolic act. It was a declaration that the vast continent before him would not remain foreign. It would become his. There is a story that before marching inland, Alexander paused to honor the heroes of old. At Troy, he visited the tomb of Achilles, his childhood idol. Picture him standing there, the wind carrying the scent of the sea, his cloak rippling, his head bowed. He offered tribute and perhaps whispered words known only to himself. A vow to live as Achilles had lived, to blaze bright, even if only briefly. For Alexander, these were not distant legends, but companions in spirit. He carried Homer's Iliad with him, a constant reminder that his own life was becoming an epic. From Troy, the army began its march. The roads of Asia stretched ahead, dusty and endless. Villagers watched in wonder as the columns passed, phalanxes moving in disciplined lines, cavalry gliding like shadows across the fields, carts carrying supplies creaking in rhythm with the tramp of feet. The air rang with the jingle of harness, the clatter of armor, the steady heartbeat of drums. At night, the camps came alive with firelight. Tents stood in neat rows, smoke from cooking fires drifted upward, and the murmur of voices filled the air. Soldiers shared bread and wine, laughter mixing with anticipation. Some wondered at the lands they would see, others at the battles to come. And among them moved Alexander, not distant upon a throne, but present, speaking with his men, listening to their concerns, sharing their meals. He was king, yet also companion. The first steps into Asia were filled with both wonder and tension. Scouts brought news of Persian satraps, governors who commanded local forces, gathering to oppose them. The Persian Empire, vast though it was, had not been idle. Yet Alexander did not falter. He studied maps by firelight, tracing routes with a steady hand. He had been taught to see war not only as clash of arms, but as movement of pieces on a vast board. His mind, sharpened by Aristotle, moved swiftly from idea to action. Can you imagine the quiet of those nights? The stars stretched wide above, brighter than any torch. The hum of insects blending with the crackle of fire. Soldiers drifted to sleep, their spears laid beside them, their dreams filled with both fear and hope. And somewhere among them, their young king remained awake, gazing eastward into the dark, already envisioning the victories to come. Crossing into Asia was more than a military campaign. It was a step into the unknown, a passage from youth into legend. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus, who had studied Homer beneath olive trees, who had led men in his father's absence, was now leading an army across the edge of the world. Each step carried him farther from home and closer to the vast destiny that awaited. The Persian Empire loomed ahead, immense and formidable. But to Alexander, it was not immovable. It was a challenge, a horizon waiting to be crossed, a story waiting to be written. The first chapter of that story had begun on the shores of the Hellespont, where a young king touched foreign soil and claimed it as his own. From there, the march would continue, toward rivers that glimmered at dawn, toward armies that waited in silence, toward battles that would decide the fate of empires. But for now, the image is simple. the sound of waves against the shore, the creak of ships at anchor, and a young man standing tall, his eyes fixed on the east. The dream of Persia alive within him. The lion had crossed the water. The hunt had begun. The sun had barely risen when the waters of the Granicus river caught its light. The current moved steadily, its surface shimmering like polished bronze. Along the far bank, Persian cavalry gathered, their armour flashing in the early glow, their banners snapping in the wind. Horses snorted and pawed the earth, men adjusted their helmets and shields, and a murmur spread across their line. The Macedonians were approaching. For Alexander, this was the moment he had awaited since setting foot in Asia. No longer was the campaign only a dream or a march across foreign soil. Here, at this river, the first true test awaited. Victory would carry his name across Asia. Failure would end the dream before it began. The Macedonian army drew up along the near bank. Rows upon rows of soldiers formed their lines, the long spears of the phalanx rising like a forest in the morning air. Cavalry shifted into place, the ground trembling faintly beneath their hooves. Imagine the scene, the hush before the storm, the breath of thousands of men held as they looked across the water, eyes fixed on the enemy. Alexander rode Bucephalus at the front. His cloak, bright against the dawn, rippled in the breeze. His helmet gleamed, but it was not the steel that caught men's attention. It was his presence. Calm, determined, his voice steady as he spoke to his troops. He reminded them that they carried not only their own honour, but the legacy of Greece. He spoke of the stories of old, of how their fathers had once resisted Persia, and how now they had the chance not merely to resist, but to conquer. The river itself posed the first challenge. Its waters, though not deep, were swift, and its banks steep in places. To charge across would be to risk disorder, to meet the Persians while still struggling through the current. Yet Alexander did not hesitate. Boldness, he knew, could break even the strongest foe. At his signal, the cavalry surged forward. Horses plunged into the water, splashes rising like silver spray. The sound of hooves on stone mixed with the roar of voices. Across the river, the Persians spurred their own mounts, driving down the banks into the shallows. The clash came with the sound of bronze on bronze, of spears striking shields, of men shouting in the struggle. Alexander himself rode at the forefront, spear in hand. He met the enemy with the vigour of youth and the precision of training. Accounts tell of how he was recognised even in the tumult, his white-plumed helmet marking him as leader. Persian nobles pressed toward him, eager to strike down the young king and end the invasion in a single blow. But Alexander, quick and fierce, fought them off. His spear broke, yet he seized another weapon and pressed on, the weight of his courage driving his men forward. Can you picture the spray of water, the glitter of sunlight on armour, the cries of men as they struggled in the current? Horses stumbled, men fell, yet the Macedonians pressed on. The phalanx followed, wading into the river in disciplined ranks. Their spears, long and unyielding, pushed back the Persians, creating space for the cavalry to surge deeper into the enemy line. The Persians, though brave, were unprepared for such determination. Their cavalry, renowned across Asia, could not break the Macedonian formation. Their blows struck shields, but the wall of spears held firm. Slowly, steadily, they began to give way. The riverbank that had seemed a barrier now became a trap, as Alexander's forces pushed them upward and back. The battle raged fiercely. Dust rose, mixing with the mist of the river. Shouts echoed across the valley, the sound carrying far into the hills. Yet through it all, Alexander remained at the center, his courage visible to all. To his soldiers, it was as if Achilles himself had returned, a warrior who did not shrink from the front but embraced it, who shared in their dangers and inspired their strength. By midday, the Persian line was broken. Their cavalry, battered and driven back, fled across the plains. The Macedonians stood victorious, their first great battle in Asia won. The cost had been real, lives lost, wounds borne, but the outcome was decisive. News of the victory would spread swiftly, carried by messengers across the empire. The young king of Macedon had not faltered. He had crossed the sea, faced the Persian forces, and triumphed. That evening, the camp was filled with both weariness and pride. Fires glowed against the dark, the scent of roasting meat rising into the air. Soldiers spoke in low voices, recounting the clash, the moment their king rode into the river, the sight of Persians breaking before them. Bread was passed, wine shared, laughter returning after the strain of battle. And among them moved Alexander, not distant in a tent of luxury, but present, speaking with his men, honoring the fallen and thanking the living. There is something profoundly human in imagining that night. A young man of 22, barely past youth, walking among seasoned soldiers, carrying on his shoulders the weight of an entire campaign. He had faced the test, and he had proven himself. Yet the journey ahead stretched long. This was only the first step into Persia. Many rivers, many battles still awaited. Still, the victory at the Granicus meant more than land or spoils. It meant belief. The Macedonians now knew their king would lead from the front, that he would share their struggles and fight at their side. Their loyalty, already strong, deepened into devotion. The Persians, meanwhile, learned a different lesson, that the boy they had dismissed as Philip's untried son was in truth a lion who had crossed into their lands and could not be easily turned back. As night settled over the valley of the Granicus, the stars glimmered above the quiet river. The water that had run red in the morning now flowed silently once more, its current steady as it had been for centuries. And along its banks, soldiers rested, dreaming not of defeat, but of horizons farther east. For Alexander, the day was a beginning, the first true clash in Asia, the first echo of greatness beyond Macedon. His march had only just begun, but already the world was taking notice. The river at dawn had tested him, and he had risen. Ahead lay cities of stone, deserts of fire, mountains of snow. But for now, in the stillness of the night, victory was his. The waters of the Granicus flowed quietly again, as though the clash of steel and the cries of battle had never disturbed their course. But far beyond the riverbanks, the echo of Alexander's first victory rippled outward. Messengers galloped along dusty roads, their horses lathered with sweat, carrying news across Asia. The young king of Macedon had crossed into Persia, had faced its satraps, and had triumphed. In the halls of Persian palaces, whispers rose into alarm. The great king, Darius III, ruler of the immense empire, heard the tidings with disbelief. To him, Alexander was still a youth, a son newly risen to his father's throne, untested against the vast weight of Persia. Yet the facts could not be ignored. Persian nobles had fallen at the Granicus, their cavalry scattered, their forces driven back by this foreign invader. What had begun as a nuisance now demanded the attention of the king himself. The Persian Empire was vast, a mosaic of peoples, languages, and lands bound together by royal roads and tribute. Its palaces glittered with gold, its treasuries swelled with wealth from every corner of its dominion. Yet its strength was also its challenge. To hold such an expanse required balance. Governors loyal in name but often ambitious in heart. Armies raised from many lands with different customs and tongues. Against such an empire, Alexander's unity of purpose gave him a sharp edge. For the Macedonians, victory at the Granicus opened a path deeper into Asia Minor. City after city considered its choice, to resist or to yield. Many, fearing the strength of Alexander's army and inspired by his clemency toward those who submitted, chose to open their gates. Others resisted, but resistance was short-lived. The discipline of the phalanx, the speed of the cavalry, and the presence of Alexander himself soon made their decision clear. Imagine the march that followed. Narrow roads winding through hills and valleys, soldiers tramping in steady rhythm, the clang of bronze echoing between cliffs. Fields of barley swayed in the wind, villages dotted the landscape, and the army pressed on, a living river of men flowing steadily eastward. At night, the camps glowed with firelight, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the scent of pine. Soldiers rested, sharpening blades, mending boots, sharing stories of home and of the boy king who rode at their head. In one city, Sardis, the Persians surrendered without a fight, handing over the great treasury that lay within. Gold and silver, enough to fill carts, flowed into Macedonian hands. To Alexander, this was not merely wealth, it was fuel, a way to fund the vast enterprise ahead. Yet he also showed restraint. He did not plunder recklessly. He sought to govern wisely, leaving local customs intact where possible, presenting himself not only as conqueror, but as rightful ruler. The more he advanced, the more his reputation grew. Tales spread of his bravery at the river, of his courtesy to those who yielded, of his vision of a united world. To the Greeks, he was a liberator, casting off Persian control from their coastal cities. To others, he was a figure of both awe and fear, a man whose youth masked an iron will. Meanwhile, Darius prepared. From his throne in Babylon, he sent out summons to his satraps and generals. Across the empire, armies began to gather, cavalry from the plains, infantry from distant provinces, archers from the east, and mercenaries from Greece itself. The great king would not allow this Macedonian upstart to carve into his empire unchecked. Picture the contrast. In Macedon's camp, Alexander sat among his companions, maps spread before him, lines traced by the flickering light of a single lamp. His voice was calm, his mind quick, every detail considered. Around him, laughter and loyalty filled the air, and far away, in Persia's great palaces, Darius sat in rooms adorned with gold and silk, surrounded by courtiers whose words mixed truth with flattery, their eyes always watchful for the king's reaction. Alexander's path soon brought him to the city of Halicarnassus, a stronghold defended fiercely by Persian loyalists and Greek mercenaries. The walls rose high, the gates reinforced. Siege engines groaned as the Macedonians pushed them forward, stones crashing against towers, fires blazing in the night. The battle was long, the defenders relentless, but Alexander would not retreat. At last, the city fell, its resistance broken, its defenders scattered into the dark. Another Persian stronghold lay in ruins, and Alexander's march pressed on. Yet for all the victories, there was a sense of gathering storm. The satraps defeated at the Granicus had been only the first line of defense. The true test lay ahead, when Darius himself would rise. For now, Alexander's men pressed deeper into Asia Minor, but in their hearts, they knew greater battles waited. Still, the days between were filled not only with struggle, but with the rhythms of life on campaign. Imagine the army moving through valleys bright with wildflowers, the air filled with bird song. Streams glimmered beneath the sun, and soldiers quenched their thirst in cool waters after long marches. In villages, children watched in wonder as the columns passed, their eyes wide at the glitter of bronze and the steady tramp of feet. At times, Alexander paused to offer sacrifice, to thank the gods for victories granted, to ask for favor in battles to come. Flames rose into the air, smoke curling skyward, prayers spoken softly into the wind. These moments gave the army a sense of connection to their past, to their faith, to the belief that destiny itself guided their steps. Can you imagine being a soldier in that march, your armor heavy on your shoulders, your feet sore from miles of road, yet your heart lifted by the certainty that you followed not just a king, but a man touched by fate? Each night, as the stars wheeled above, you might wonder how far this journey would take you, and whether you would see your home again. For Alexander, there was no doubt. His mind pressed always eastward, his heart restless for the challenge to come. He knew that Persia would not remain silent. He knew that soon, perhaps very soon, he would face Darius himself. And in that knowledge, there was no fear, only anticipation. The march through Asia Minor was more than a series of conquests. It was the gathering of momentum, the tightening of a bowstring before release. Each city taken, each stronghold subdued, brought Alexander closer to the heart of the empire. The Persians, once dismissive, now trembled. The Greeks, once hesitant, now believed. And so, as the summer sun blazed over the roads of Asia, Alexander pressed on. His soldiers marched, their shadows long on the ground, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The air was filled with dust and determination, the hum of an army moving with purpose. Somewhere ahead, Darius prepared his answer. Somewhere, in the wide plains of Asia, the great king and the young lion of Macedon would meet. But for now, the road stretched onward, the rhythm of footsteps steady, the dream of empire alive. The march through Asia had carried Alexander across rivers, plains, and strongholds. The Persian satraps had fallen, cities had opened their gates, and Darius himself had been forced to flee before Macedonian steel. Yet Alexander's journey did not stop at the heart of Persia alone. His path bent southward, across the desert roads, toward a land ancient beyond imagining. Egypt. Egypt, the kingdom of the Nile, had lived for millennia before Macedon rose from its hills. Its temples of stone, its pyramids standing against the sky, its river winding endlessly to the sea, all spoke of a civilization as old as memory itself. For the Greeks, Egypt was a place of wonder and mystery, where gods walked in the form of falcons and cats, where pharaohs once ruled as divine beings. And now into this land came Alexander, the young king of Macedon, carrying both conquest and vision. When he entered Egypt, the people did not resist. To them, the Persians had been harsh overlords, rulers who cared little for their sacred traditions. The arrival of Alexander felt less like invasion and more like deliverance. They welcomed him not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, greeting him with garlands, music, and offerings of bread and wine. Imagine the streets of Memphis alive with color, the air heavy with incense, priests in white linen leading processions to honor the new ruler. Alexander, ever attentive to the customs of those he ruled, honored their gods in turn. He visited temples, offered sacrifice to Egyptian deities, and walked among priests with respect. In their eyes, he was not only king, but something more. They named him Pharaoh, the rightful ruler of Egypt, and in their voices, he heard acceptance deeper than mere obedience. Yet Alexander's vision stretched farther still. He saw Egypt not only as a jewel in his growing empire, but as a bridge between worlds. Along the coast of the Mediterranean, near the island of Pharos, he marked the site for a city, one that would bear his name, Alexandria. Picture the shoreline, waves breaking gently against the sand, seabirds wheeling above, the salt wind tugging at cloaks and banners. There, in the soft earth, Alexander traced the lines of streets with flower, marking broad avenues that would one day host markets and scholars, temples and theatres. His engineers stood by, taking note, their eyes widening as they realized the scale of his vision. Alexandria would be more than a city. It would be a beacon, a place where East met West, where Greek and Egyptian traditions mingled, where merchants, sailors, and scholars from across the world might gather. A city of light, of trade, of knowledge. Even in that moment, as the young king stood on the shore with the sea wind in his hair, the seeds of one of history's greatest cities were sown. But Alexander's journey in Egypt was not complete with cities and crowns. He longed for something deeper, a sign from the gods themselves. And so, he set out across the desert to visit the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, a place sacred and remote, where the voice of the divine was said to speak. The desert stretched vast before him. Sand rolled like waves of the sea. The sun blazed overhead, and the wind whispered across endless dunes. His men marched with determination, their footprints vanishing almost as soon as they were made. The heat pressed down, and the horizon shimmered in the distance. Yet Alexander pressed onward, driven by a hunger not of conquest, but of spirit. At last, the oasis of Siwa appeared, green palms rising like a vision against the gold of the desert. Springs bubbled clear, and the temple of Ammon stood in quiet majesty. Within, priests led Alexander to the inner sanctum. The air was cool, the scent of incense thick, and in the dim light he asked his question. What the oracle told him remains a mystery, for Alexander never spoke of it fully. Some said the priests greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon, a man touched by divinity. Others whispered he asked about his destiny, and that the answer confirmed what he already believed, that his path was guided by more than mortal hands. Can you imagine him there? A young man, dust of the desert still clinging to his cloak, standing in the half-light of a sacred chamber, hearing words that seemed to come not from men, but from eternity itself. Whether truth or legend, the moment deepened his resolve. He would not simply be a king, he would be something greater, a figure whose story would stretch across time. From Siwa, he returned to Egypt, his place among its people secure, his vision of Alexandria already taking form. The Nile rolled on, its waters feeding the fields, its current steady as the heartbeat of the land. Priests chanted in temples, farmers bent over crops, children played along riverbanks. Life continued as it had for centuries. And yet, in the midst of that timeless flow, Alexander's presence was like a spark, new and bright, reshaping the destiny of Egypt. At night, perhaps he stood along the banks of the Nile, the stars glittering above, their reflections trembling on the water. He had been welcomed as Pharaoh, declared the son of a god, and marked the ground for a city that would outlast him. Did he feel, in that quiet, the enormity of what he had begun? Did he sense that his name would linger not only in the memory of battles, but in stone, in learning, in the lives of those who would walk the streets of Alexandria long after his own footsteps had faded? Egypt embraced him, and Alexander embraced Egypt. But his journey did not end there. The Persian king still lived, and his empire still stood. The Nile's calm waters would soon give way to the clash of arms once more, as Alexander turned his eyes back east, toward the plains where Darius waited with an army vast enough to shake the earth. Yet for a moment, in Egypt, there was peace. The desert winds had carried him to the voice of the oracle, the people had crowned him pharaoh, and the sea had received the first marks of a city that would shine for centuries. The lion had paused, not to rest, but to build, to root his dream in stone before pressing onward. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Egypt whispered its welcome to the young conqueror who had stepped into its timeless embrace. The desert winds of Egypt were behind him, and the Nile's calm waters faded into memory. Alexander's path now turned eastward again, toward the Persian heartland. Darius still lived, and with him remained the immense weight of the Persian Empire. If the dream of conquering Asia was to be realized, one final clash would decide its fate. The year was 331 BCE. Word reached Alexander that Darius had gathered an army vast beyond counting, men drawn from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Bactrians, Scythians from the steppes, and even elephants brought from distant India. They assembled on the plains near the village of Gaugamela, where the land stretched wide and open, perfect for a battle on a grand scale. The Macedonian soldiers knew the test would be unlike any they had faced before. The Granicus had been fierce, Issus had been bloody, but here, the full might of Persia awaited. Some whispered of the enemy's numbers. Hundreds of thousands, it was said, though perhaps less in truth. Even so, they outnumbered the Macedonians many times over. Yet Alexander did not waver. In his eyes, numbers alone could not defeat discipline, courage, and the unity of purpose that bound his men to him. On the night before the battle, the camp lay quiet beneath a canopy of stars. Fires burned low, the smell of smoke drifting through the cool air. Soldiers lay upon their cloaks, some in restless sleep, others gazing upward at the constellations. They thought of home, of families left behind, of the dawn to come, and in the midst of them moved their king, calm, offering words of steadiness, reminding them that together they had crossed rivers, taken cities, and defeated Persia's forces before. Darius, meanwhile, prepared in splendor. His chariot, adorned with gold, stood ready. His court, rich with silks and jewels, followed him into the field. He placed his faith in numbers, in elephants, in scythed chariots meant to slice through ranks of men. He believed the sheer weight of Persia would crush the Macedonians once and for all. The dawn of battle came. The sun rose over the plains, painting the land in gold. Across the wide field, the Persian army stretched, banners snapping in the wind, the rumble of chariots and the trumpeting of elephants echoing like distant thunder. On the other side, The Macedonians stood in tight formation, their phalanx a living wall of spears, their cavalry poised like coiled energy at the wings. Alexander, mounted on Bucephalus, rode before his men. His cloak streamed in the breeze, his white-plumed helmet bright against the sky. He raised his voice so all could hear. Today, he told them, would decide not only the fate of Macedon, but the fate of Asia itself. Victory would bring them riches, lands, and glory beyond measure. Defeat was not an option. His words, firm and clear, settled in their hearts like steady fire. Then the battle began. Darius sent forth his scythed chariots, their blades gleaming, wheels cutting across the plain. They thundered toward the Macedonian line, the ground trembling beneath their charge. But Alexander had prepared. His men opened their ranks, creating channels. Arrows rained down, spears thrust forward, and horses balked. Many chariots crashed harmlessly into the gaps, their drivers cut down before they could cause havoc. The threat that seemed terrifying was broken with discipline and calm. Next came the Persian cavalry, surging toward the Macedonian right. Alexander wheeled his own horsemen into motion, leading them in a fierce countercharge. The clash shook the earth, hooves pounding, bronze striking bronze, dust rising in great clouds. At the center, the phalanx pressed forward, their long spears unrelenting, their shields locked tight. In the midst of the chaos, Alexander saw his chance. The Persian line, stretched wide, began to falter under pressure. He gathered his companion cavalry, the men closest to him, and pointed toward the gap. With a cry, he spurred Bucephalus forward, leading his horsemen in a wedge straight into the heart of the Persian army. Imagine the sight. A shining spear point of riders cutting through the mass, Alexander at its tip, his face set with determination, his men following with unwavering loyalty. They broke through, reaching the place where Darius's royal chariot stood. The great king, seeing the charge rushing toward him, lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled, the dust of retreat rising behind him. The sight of their king abandoning the field broke Persian morale. Panic rippled through their ranks, men casting down weapons, horses bolting. The vast army that had once seemed invincible began to dissolve. Alexander pressed forward, but his aim was not slaughter. He sought victory, and victory was his. By nightfall, the field of Gaugamela lay quiet. The dust settled, the cries of battle faded, and the stars once more glimmered above. The Macedonians, though weary, knew they had achieved something extraordinary. They had faced the full might of Persia, and they had triumphed. Alexander stood among them, his cloak stained with dust, his armor dented, but his spirit unbroken. He had not only won a battle, he had broken an empire. Darius fled eastward, but his power was shattered. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, the treasures of Persia, lay ahead, ready to fall into Alexander's hands. That night, fires glowed across the plain as soldiers rested. Some sang softly, their voices carrying on the cool air. Others lay silent, staring into the sky, hardly believing what they had seen. Their young king, not yet 25, had faced the greatest power of the known world and prevailed. The road before them stretched endless, yet for that moment, victory filled their hearts. And so, the tide had turned. At Gaugamela, Alexander was no longer only the king of Macedon, nor even the commander of Greece. He had become, in truth, the master of Asia. The lion had faced the storm, and the storm had broken. The dust of Gaugamela still lingered in memory, but its consequences were already reshaping the world. Darius had fled eastward, his chariot vanishing into the horizon, his empire fractured. And Alexander, victor on the field, now marched not into another battle, but into the very heart of Persia. First came Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. For centuries, travelers had spoken of its walls, its hanging gardens, its vast temples reaching toward the heavens. When Alexander and his army approached, they braced themselves for a siege. But the city did not resist. Instead, its gates swung wide, and its people poured out to greet the young conqueror. Imagine the scene: the broad avenues lined with palm trees, the air heavy with incense, crowds bowing as Alexander rode in upon Bucephalus. Musicians played flutes and lyres, priests in bright robes led processions, and children scattered petals beneath the hooves of horses. To the Babylonians, Alexander was not only conqueror, but liberator, a new ruler to replace the Persian king who had fled. Alexander entered the great temples, offering sacrifices to the gods of Babylon. He respected their traditions, as he had in Egypt, and the people marveled at his willingness to honor their faith. In return, they proclaimed him not only king, but chosen of the gods, a title that resonated through the vast halls of their ziggurats. The treasures of Babylon flowed into his hands: gold, silver, stores of grain and oil, jewels that glittered in the torchlight. Yet Alexander was not greedy. He used the wealth to pay his soldiers, to supply his armies, to prepare for the long road ahead. The men, weary yet devoted, saw in their leader both generosity and vision. They had fought hard, and their rewards were tangible. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another city of splendor. Its palaces gleamed with inlaid stone and shining columns. Its treasuries overflowed with riches gathered from across the empire. Here, too, the people yielded without a fight, and here Alexander gathered wealth so immense that it seemed beyond counting. With each step deeper into Persia, the young king was no longer only conqueror. He was becoming something greater, a ruler of nations, a master of empires. But the crown jewel awaited: Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, the seat of kings stretching back generations. Its terraces and halls rose against the sky, adorned with carvings of warriors, lions, and winged figures. To the Persians, it was sacred ground, the symbol of their greatness. To Alexander, it was both prize and challenge. The march toward Persepolis was long, winding through mountains and valleys where Persian loyalists still resisted. Winter winds swept across the passes, cold air biting at faces, snow dusting the peaks. Yet the Macedonians pressed forward, their cloaks drawn tight, their breath visible in the chill. Fires flickered in the camps at night, the crackle of wood mingling with the distant howl of wind. Through hardship, the army held steady, driven by the promise of what lay ahead. At last, the gates of Persepolis opened. Alexander entered, and the sight must have taken his breath. Imagine vast halls lined with tall columns, their tops carved into shapes of bulls and griffins. Stone reliefs show processions of tribute bearers, their gifts once destined for Persian kings. The stairways were broad, polished by centuries of footsteps, and the treasures within the palace glimmered like starlight caught in gold. For a time, Alexander admired, respected, and absorbed the majesty of the city. He allowed his men to take their share of wealth, though he also restrained excess, mindful of the city's significance. Yet something stirred within him, perhaps triumph. Perhaps anger for the old wars when Persia had burned Athens. Perhaps the restless energy of a man who could not stand still. One night, after feasting and wine, a fire was set. Whether by accident, drunken impulse, or deliberate command remains uncertain. But soon, flames licked the walls of Persepolis, their glow rising into the night sky. The wooden roofs crackled, embers soared upward, and the great palace of Xerxes, once the symbol of Persian majesty, was consumed. The soldiers watched in silence, their faces lit by firelight. Some felt awe, others sorrow. To burn Persepolis was to burn the memory of an empire, to erase its pride in smoke and ash. Alexander himself, it is said, later regretted the act. Yet the image endured. The young conqueror standing before a sea of flames, his cloak billowing in the heat, the shadows of ruin dancing around him. After Persepolis, Alexander turned once more to pursuit. Darius, though defeated, still lived, fleeing eastward, gathering what forces remained. To Alexander, it was not enough to take cities and treasuries. The Persian king himself must be captured. And so the march continued, deeper and deeper into lands unfamiliar, across deserts and highlands, where the roads narrowed and the horizon stretched far beyond the limits of Greece. But in these days, Alexander was no longer seen only as king of Macedon or commander of Greeks. He had become, in the eyes of many, the king of kings. He ruled Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. He held the heart of the Persian Empire in his grasp. His men, once ordinary soldiers of a small kingdom, now walked streets paved with wealth, their eyes filled with wonder at temples and palaces beyond imagining. At night, in the quiet of his tent, perhaps Alexander reflected on how far he had come. The boy, who once studied under Aristotle in the olive groves of Macedon, now ruled lands that stretched farther than any Greek had dreamed. The Iliad lay beside him still, its verses a companion through victory and fire. Did he feel Achilles close at hand, whispering of glory won and glory fleeting? Did he sense, even in triumph, the fragility of all things? The empire of Persia had not vanished, not yet. Darius still breathed, and resistance lingered in distant provinces. But in the halls of Persepolis, in the temples of Babylon, in the treasures of Susa, the truth was clear. The tide had turned. The great empire that had once humbled Greece now bowed to a foreign king. And Alexander, standing amidst both ruin and splendor, knew his journey was far from over. Eastward, the road stretched, into lands uncharted, into challenges yet unseen. But for now, the title was his: conqueror of Persia, ruler of nations, king of kings. The halls of Persepolis lay in ruins, its treasures carried away, its palaces darkened by smoke. Babylon and Susa had welcomed Alexander as king, and Darius, once ruler of the vast Persian Empire, was gone, betrayed and slain as he fled eastward. Alexander, finding his enemy's body, had honoured him with a burial fit for a king. The conquest of Persia was complete. And yet, Alexander did not stop. For him, victory was not a resting place, but a doorway. Beyond Persia lay lands his teachers had spoken of only in whispers. Strange kingdoms, rivers wider than imagination, creatures unknown to the Greeks. Aristotle had told him of India, of elephants as large as towers, of spices fragrant as incense, of peoples who lived under skies blazing hotter than the Mediterranean sun. To Alexander, such tales were not boundaries but invitations. So once more the army marched eastward. The journey carried them through Bactria and Sogdiana, regions of rugged mountains and wide valleys. The terrain was harsh, the air thin and sharp, the winters bitter with cold. Snow capped the peaks and winds howled through the passes. At night, the soldiers huddled by fires, cloaks drawn tight, the stars brilliant above them. They grumbled at the endless marches, yet they followed still, bound by loyalty to their king. Alexander himself never faltered. He rode at the front, enduring the same hardships as his men. When food was scarce, he ate what they ate. When water ran low, he refused to drink until his soldiers had been served. These small acts deepened their devotion, even as weariness grew. To them, he was not only commander, but companion, sharing the same dust, the same hunger, the same cold. In these lands, Alexander also faced resistance, unlike that of the Persian heartland. The people of Bactria and Sogdiana were fierce, skilled horsemen who struck swiftly and vanished into the hills. Villages resisted. Strongholds clung stubbornly to their independence. Alexander fought not only armies, but the spirit of defiance rooted deep in mountain soil. Yet he did not rely on force alone. He married Roxana, a princess of Sogdiana, her beauty and grace admired even by his toughest soldiers. Their union was both personal and political, binding him to the land and its people. Around the campfires, men whispered of their king's choice, a foreign bride, yet one whose presence seemed to soften the distance between Macedonian and local alike. Still, Alexander's gaze pressed farther. Tales of the Indus River reached him, of fertile lands beyond the mountains, of rulers who commanded elephants in war. To the Greeks, India was the edge of the world, where the earth met the unknown. For Alexander, it was the next horizon to conquer. The army crossed the towering Hindu Kush, their feet trudging through snow that blinded the eyes and chilled the bones. The wind howled, thin and merciless, carrying flakes of ice across their faces. Horses stumbled, supplies thinned, and men fell along the way. Yet the army endured, step by step, until at last the mountains gave way to warmer valleys. The land of India spread before them, green, fertile, and alive with rivers. The change must have felt extraordinary. After months of barren heights and icy passes, the soldiers now saw fields of rice, groves of fruit, and waters that glittered beneath the sun. The air was heavy with new scents, spices, flowers, the smoke of unfamiliar fires. Birds of bright colours wheeled overhead, their cries unlike any the Greeks had heard before. It was as though they had stepped into another world, one filled with wonders and strangeness. The people of these lands looked with awe at the Macedonians, their bronze armour glinting, their long spears bristling like a forest. Some submitted, offering tribute of food, jewels, and elephants. Others resisted, and battles flared across the valleys. Alexander met each with determination, his phalanx steady, his cavalry swift. Among the rulers of India was Porus, a king of great stature who commanded warriors mounted on elephants. To Alexander, this was both a challenge and a marvel. Never before had his men faced beasts of such size, their tusks gleaming, their trunks curling, their sheer presence enough to shake courage. Yet Alexander did not retreat. Instead, he prepared for the test to come, the crossing of the Hydaspes river, where Porus and his elephants awaited. But before that clash, there were nights of rest along the riverbanks. Imagine the Macedonian camp under the Indian sky. Fires flickering against the dark, the air filled with the hum of insects, the murmur of a river broad and strong. Soldiers lay upon the earth, staring upward at constellations unfamiliar. The southern stars strange to their eyes. They whispered of home, of the Aegean Sea, of fields and families far away. And some wondered aloud, how much farther would their king lead them? How far could one man's vision stretch? Alexander, walking among them, heard their words. He knew their weariness, their longing. Yet in his own heart, the fire burned unquenched. He believed the world had no edge, only horizons to be crossed. He told his men of the glory yet to come, of the riches of India, of the chance to carve their names into eternity. Some grumbled, but most still believed, for they had seen him charge at Granicus, stand unyielding at Issus, claim the field at Gaugamela. If anyone could lead them beyond the edge of the world, it was Alexander. And so the march continued, deeper into India. The rivers grew broader, the forests denser, the air heavy with humidity. Strange animals appeared, monkeys leaping through trees, crocodiles lurking in waters, elephants moving with slow, majestic steps. To the Greeks, it was a land of wonder, filled with both beauty and danger. The stage was set for the next great trial, the meeting of Alexander and Porus, the thunder of elephants and the discipline of the phalanx. But even before that clash, the journey itself had changed the Macedonians. They were no longer simply men of Greece or Macedon. They were travellers at the edge of the known world, witnesses to lands that few of their people had even imagined. At night, as the river flowed beside their camp, perhaps Alexander stood alone, the sound of water mingling with the cries of distant animals. The stars wheeled slowly above, vast and eternal. Did he wonder if he was nearing the limits of the world? Or did he feel only the unending pull of horizons, calling him always forward? Whatever his thoughts, his resolve was clear. Persia had fallen, Babylon and Persepolis were his, yet his journey stretched on. Toward India, toward rivers yet to be crossed, toward battles yet to be fought. The lion did not rest at the edge of the world. He prowled onward, eyes fixed on the dawn. The rains had come. Heavy monsoon clouds rolled across the sky, their shadows sweeping over the broad plain. Lightning flashed in the distance, thunder rumbled like the growl of some ancient beast. The air was heavy with moisture, the ground soft beneath the soldiers' boots, and the great river Hydaspes swelled with the weight of storm-fed waters. On one side of the river stood Alexander, his army weathered by years of marching, but still bound together by loyalty and hope. On the other side waited King Porus, ruler of a proud land, tall as a giant, seated upon a horse of his own, and commanding warriors unlike any the Macedonians had yet faced. With him stood his secret weapon, elephants, towering creatures, their tusks capped with bronze, their bodies armoured, their trunks curling with restless power. To the Greeks, these beasts were living mountains. They trumpeted so loudly that the air shook. Horses quivered at the sound. Men tightened their grips on spear and shield. The elephants loomed, each carrying a tower of archers and warriors upon its back, their eyes glinting in the stormlight. For the Macedonians, who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had stood against Persia's endless hosts, this was something wholly new. Alexander studied the scene with calm. The river lay between them, swollen and fierce. To cross directly under the eyes of Porus would be suicide. But Alexander had learned patience as well as daring. He watched the currents, the bends of the river, the patterns of wind and rain. Then, under cover of darkness and storm, he made his move. On a wild night, as thunder rolled overhead, Alexander led a chosen force upriver. The rain lashed down, cloaks clung heavy to their shoulders, and the river roared in its swollen bed. With rafts and boats, with horses swimming beside them, the Macedonians crossed. The water surged cold and strong around them, carrying men downstream, but most reached the far bank, hauling themselves up into the mud, dripping and breathless. Dawn broke grey and wet, revealing Alexander's men forming ranks on Porus's side of the river. Porus, realizing the maneuver, wheeled his army to meet them. His elephants advanced, their massive feet pounding the earth, their trumpets echoing like thunder. Behind them marched thousands of infantry, their shields gleaming in the rain. Cavalry swept wide across the plain, their hooves splashing through puddles. The two armies met in a clash that shook the ground. The elephants charged first, their sheer size terrifying. They crashed into the Macedonian lines, tusks thrusting, trunks curling around men and hurling them aside. Horses reared in terror. Soldiers cried out. The phalanx wavered under the living onslaught. Yet Alexander had prepared. His men thrust their long spears at the elephants' eyes and trunks, targeting the softest points. Arrows rained down, piercing hides. The beasts roared, enraged, some turning wild and trampling friend and foe alike. Still, the danger was immense. The elephants pressed forward, their armoured towers looming over the ranks. Men fell beneath their weight. The ground turned to mud beneath thrashing feet. The air was filled with the mingled cries of beasts and men, the clash of bronze, the hiss of arrows through rain. Alexander himself led his cavalry against Porus's horsemen. The ground was slick, mud clinging to hooves, but the Macedonian charge was fierce. With precision, he wheeled and struck, breaking through the flanks, driving Porus's riders back step by step. Again and again, he circled, pressing the advantage, refusing to let the Indian cavalry regroup. Meanwhile, the phalanx held steady. Though battered, they did not break. Their spears stabbed again and again, their shields locked tight, their discipline unyielding even under the weight of elephants. Slowly, methodically, they turned the tide. The elephants, wounded and panicked, began to falter. Some collapsed, trumpeting in agony. Others turned back, trampling their own lines in confusion. Porus, towering on his horse, fought with unmatched bravery. His great bow sent arrows whistling. His spear cut through the fray, his presence a beacon to his men. Even as the battle turned against him, he refused to flee. He fought with the dignity of a king who would not abandon his people, his tall figure rising above the chaos, rain streaming down his armor. But Alexander's strategy, patience and discipline prevailed. At last, the Indian line broke. Men scattered across the plain, elephants limped away, the storm washing blood and mud together on the trampled ground. Porus himself, though wounded and weary, stood firm until the very end. When at last he was captured and brought before Alexander, the young king looked upon the Indian ruler with admiration. Porus was asked how he wished to be treated. His answer was simple: like a king. Alexander, moved by his courage and dignity, granted him not only mercy but honor. He restored Porus to his throne, allowing him to rule as Alexander's ally. The gesture astonished his men, but it reflected Alexander's vision: to build an empire not only of conquest, but of respect, binding kings and peoples together through loyalty as well as force. That night, the battlefield lay silent. The rain had eased, The thunder faded into the distance. Fires flickered in the camps, their smoke rising into the damp air. Soldiers, exhausted, sat quietly, reflecting on what they had faced. They had seen elephants towering above them, felt the ground shake beneath their charge, smelled the damp earth torn by hoof and tusk. And they had endured. The river Hydaspes flowed quietly again, its swollen waters reflecting the pale moon. Along its banks, the camp rested. Some dreamed of home, others of the wonders they had seen, still others of the endless road ahead. And Alexander, in the stillness, knew that even at the edge of the world, his destiny burned undimmed. Yet even in triumph, he saw the strain in his men's eyes. They had followed him across deserts, mountains, and rivers. They had faced storms, elephants, and endless marches. Their loyalty was deep, but their bodies and hearts were weary. Soon, they would ask how much farther the road could stretch. For now, though, the lion had faced the thunder, and the thunder had bowed. At the Hydaspes, Alexander had written another chapter of glory, not only in victory, but in the respect shown to a worthy king. The march eastward would continue, but this battle, fought in the rain and mud of India, would echo through the ages. The victory at the Hydaspes had brought Alexander new glory, but also a turning point. His men had faced elephants, storms, and endless marches. They had fought with courage and endured with loyalty. Yet their hearts began to ache for home. After years of campaigning, the soldiers longed for the fields of Macedon, for the familiar shores of the Aegean, for the comfort of their families. In the quiet of campfires, voices murmured of return. And when Alexander spoke of pressing farther east, to rivers beyond the Indus, to lands no Greek had ever seen, the murmurs grew louder. At last, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, his men refused to march farther. They had followed him to the edge of the world, but their strength was spent. Alexander, though restless, listened. He withdrew to his tent, silent for days, wrestling with disappointment. He had dreamed of oceans that circled the earth, of horizons without end. But even the lion must heed the weariness of his pride. At last, he agreed to turn back. The return was not easy. The path westward led through lands scarred by battle and resistance. Villages resisted, strongholds defied, rivers swelled in flood. Yet the greatest challenge came not from men, but from nature itself. The vast Gedrosian desert. Imagine the scene. Endless sands stretching to the horizon, the sun blazing white in a cloudless sky. The heat pressed down like a weight, the air shimmered with mirages, and the ground beneath their feet was dry and shifting. Day after day, the army marched, their cloaks drawn tight against the burning wind, their lips cracked, their skin blistered. Water was scarce, food scarcer still. Men collapsed in the dust, their strength gone. Horses faltered, camels stumbled, supplies dwindled to nothing. The desert seemed an enemy, greater than any army, silent, merciless, unyielding. And yet, Alexander endured with his men. One day, a group of soldiers found a small flask of water and brought it to him. He looked at the gift, precious as life itself, and then poured it out upon the ground where all could see. "If my men cannot drink," he said, "then neither will I." The act, though it cost him dearly, gave them courage. They tightened their belts, steadied their steps, and pressed onward. Nights in the desert brought little relief. The heat of the day gave way to cold winds, the stars glittering sharp against a black sky. Fires burned weakly, their smoke whipped away by the gusts. Soldiers lay on the sand, weary beyond words, their bodies aching, their dreams filled with visions of home. Through it all, Alexander walked among them, his presence a steady flame. He spoke of the glories they had achieved, of the riches they had gathered, of the legacy that would endure beyond their lifetimes. His words reminded them that they were more than weary wanderers. They were companions in an epic, names that would be remembered. At last, after weeks of hardship, the desert released them. The army stumbled into fertile lands once more, fields green with crops, rivers flowing cool and sweet. The men drank deeply, their thirst quenched, their strength returning. But they did not forget the desert. Its memory lingered, a trial as fierce as any battle, a test of endurance that marked them forever. From there, the march continued westward. Alexander reorganized his empire, placing governors in cities, founding new settlements to secure his conquests. He dreamed of blending East and West, of creating a world where Greeks and Persians, Macedonians and Indians lived under one rule, bound by loyalty rather than division. He encouraged his men to take local wives, to share in the cultures they had conquered. Some grumbled, others embraced the vision, but all recognized that their king's dreams stretched beyond mere conquest. Yet the cost was plain. The army that had once been fresh and eager was now worn and scarred. Faces were leaner, hair streaked with grey, eyes older than their years. They had marched through deserts and storms, crossed mountains and rivers, fought in lands no Greek had ever known. They were still loyal, still bound to Alexander, but they were tired. Alexander himself carried the weight as well. Though his spirit remained restless, his body bore the marks of wounds, his face shadowed with care. At night, perhaps he sat alone, oil lamps flickering in his tent, scrolls and maps spread before him. Did he think of Aristotle's lessons, of Homer's verses, of the youthful dreams that had carried him so far? Did he wonder if the edge of the world lay just beyond his grasp, or if he had already reached it? The return journey was not only a march of weariness, but of reflection. Each step westward was a step back toward familiar lands, yet also a step away from the boundless horizons that had driven Alexander all his life. The soldiers longed for home, the king longed for more. Still, together they marched, the bond between them unbroken by hardship. They had crossed the Gedrosian desert, survived hunger and thirst, faced storms and sun, and emerged alive. Their loyalty to Alexander, though tested, had endured. And so, the army pressed onward, their shadows stretching long across the sands, their hearts heavy but steady. The lion and his pride walked the long road home, carrying with them not only scars and memories, but the echo of greatness that no desert, no storm could erase. The long march through deserts and valleys, through storms and rivers, had brought Alexander at last back to the heart of his empire. Babylon, the city of gardens and broad avenues, welcomed him once more. Its walls rose tall against the plain, its gates adorned with lions and bulls, its streets alive with merchants, musicians, and priests. Here, in the city that had once been the jewel of Mesopotamia, Alexander set his throne. He was still young, not yet 33, yet he had conquered more than any king before him. From Macedon to Egypt, from Persia to India, his banners had flown across mountains and seas. He was master of empires, hailed as Pharaoh, king of kings, son of Zeus Ammon. But though his conquests seemed endless, his body now bore the marks of every mile. Wounds scarred his flesh, weariness lingered as his bones, and the weight of command pressed heavy upon him. In Babylon, Alexander dreamed anew. He spoke of campaigns yet to come, into Arabia, into distant lands beyond the seas. Maps spread across marble tables showed coastlines yet uncharted, islands yet unnamed. His companions listened, some with awe, others with unease. For while their king's spirit still burned, their own hearts longed for rest. The city itself offered wonder. Gardens spilled with flowers, water cascaded in fountains, palms swayed gently in the warm breeze. In its temples, priests chanted hymns, incense curled into the air, and the ziggurats reached toward the heavens. Alexander walked these halls, offering sacrifice, speaking with sages, gazing upon the stars from Babylon's towers. He saw himself not only as conqueror but as unifier, a man who might weave together East and West into a single fabric. He encouraged his men to take wives from the lands they had conquered, binding cultures through family. He adopted Persian dress at times, mingled Greek and Eastern customs, and spoke of an empire that was not only Macedonian but universal. Some among his men resisted, clinging to the traditions of their homeland, but others embraced the vision. Alexander, restless as always, pressed forward with his dream. Yet even as he dreamed, shadows gathered. In the spring of 323 BCE, the king fell ill. At first it seemed nothing more than fever, the heat of Babylon weighing on his body. But the days passed, and the sickness deepened. His voice weakened, his limbs grew heavy, and the fire that had once carried him across continents flickered. In the palace, silence fell. Courtiers moved in whispers, generals stood with faces grave, servants walked softly along the stone corridors. Outside, soldiers gathered in anxious crowds, waiting for word of their king. Alexander, lying upon his bed, still thought of the empire. Maps lay near his bedside, notes of campaigns yet to come, names of cities he wished to found. He spoke of Arabia, of seas yet unexplored. His voice, faint but steady, carried the same determination it always had. But his body betrayed him. Each day, the fever burned hotter. Each night, his strength waned. His companions came to his side. Hephaestion was gone, long mourned, but others remained. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas. They stood near, silent and grieving, their eyes fixed on the man who had led them through deserts and storms, who had shared their dangers and their triumphs. As his illness grew worse, the soldiers demanded to see him. They could not bear the thought that their king might slip away unseen. And so, weak though he was, Alexander allowed it. One by one, thousands of men filed past his chamber, the air heavy with incense and sorrow. Too weak to speak, Alexander raised his hand to them in silence, his eyes meeting theirs. It was enough. They wept, not only for their king, but for the companion who had marched with them, fought with them, suffered with them. Outside, the Euphrates flowed quietly, its waters glinting in the sun. The gardens of Babylon rustled in the warm breeze, birds sang in the palms, children laughed in the markets. Life continued, unaware that history itself was shifting. At last, in the heat of June, Alexander's voice fell silent. The fever claimed him, and the young king who had crossed seas, who had founded cities, who had broken empires, was gone. He was 32 years old. Grief spread like a shadow. Soldiers tore their cloaks, companions wept openly, priests chanted prayers. The great conqueror lay still, his face calm, his body at rest. Around him, his empire stretched vast, too vast for one man's hand to hold. In the days that followed, his generals would quarrel, his territories would divide, his vision would fragment. But in that moment, all was silence. Can you picture the stillness of that chamber? The oil lamps flickering, the air thick with incense, the quiet rustle of robes as men bowed their heads. The man who had been restless as the wind, who had never paused in life, now lay unmoving. The lion's flame had faded. Yet in the quiet, something more remained. For Alexander's story was not only in conquest or in empire, but in the dreams he left behind. He had carried the Iliad with him, walked in the footsteps of Achilles, sought to see horizons no Greek had ever known. He had tried to unite peoples, to build cities that would endure, to stretch the imagination of what one life could hold. And though his body rested in Babylon, his name would not. His companions would carry his legacy, his cities would flourish, his story would echo in every age that followed. The Euphrates flowed on, steady and eternal, as if whispering that life continues even when flames fade. Babylon's gardens bloomed, its people bustled, its temples sang with prayer. And somewhere in the quiet, the spirit of Alexander lingered. Not as conqueror or king, but as a man whose dream had reached for the edge of the world. The chamber in Babylon grew silent after Alexander's final breath. The oil lamps burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Soldiers lingered outside the palace, their voices hushed, their hearts heavy. For years they had marched behind their king, across mountains, deserts, and rivers. They had followed him to the edge of the known world. And now, their journey was over. But though Alexander lay still, his story did not end. His empire stretched vast, too vast for one man's successors to hold. In the days after his death, his generals gathered, their faces stern, their voices rising in dispute. Who would inherit the lion's mantle? Some argued for his unborn child, others for his half-brother. None could agree. At last, the empire was divided, carved into pieces by the very men who had once fought side by side. Yet even broken, Alexander's legacy endured. His companions carried his name east and west, ruling lands in his memory, building cities that bore his mark. The most famous, Alexandria in Egypt, grew into a beacon of knowledge and trade, its library gathering scrolls from across the world, its lighthouse guiding ships safely into harbour. Long after Alexander's body was gone, the city he envisioned stood as a living echo of his dream. In the lands he conquered, cultures mingled. Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Indian, traditions crossed and blended. Ideas travelled along roads and seas. Scholars call it the Hellenistic Age, a time when art, science and philosophy flourished in a world knit together by Alexander's conquests. Statues rose in his image, coins bore his profile, and stories of his deeds spread across continents. Imagine the tales told by travellers of a king who tamed a wild horse as a boy, who charged into rivers at dawn, who faced elephants in the storm of India. Parents told their children of the young conqueror whose fire had burned too bright, who had seen the edge of the world and returned with visions of unity. For some, he was a hero. For others, a warning. But for all, he was unforgettable. Even in distant lands, Alexander's name lived on. In Persia, he was remembered as Iskander, a figure both feared and admired. In Egypt, he was honoured as pharaoh, his tomb a site of reverence. In India, his meeting with King Porus was recalled as a moment of respect between rulers. His story crossed languages and cultures, shaping legends wherever it travelled. And through it all, the memory of the man himself softened into myth. Was he truly the son of Zeus Ammon, as the oracle at Siwa had whispered? Was he destined from birth to conquer, as omens foretold? Or was he simply a mortal, driven by dreams larger than his years could contain? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Alexander was human. He felt weariness, sorrow, longing. He mourned companions lost, suffered wounds, and bore the loneliness of command. Yet he also touched something greater: the courage to see horizons as beginnings, not ends. The vision to imagine a world united, not divided. In that, his life became more than mortal. As centuries passed, empires rose and fell, kings ruled and faded. But Alexander's story remained. Writers set his deeds into histories, poets wove them into verse, artists carved them into stone. His life became a mirror in which later generations saw both ambition and fragility, both glory and transience. Picture for a moment the quiet after his passing. Babylon's gardens rustle in the evening breeze. The Euphrates flows steady and calm. Stars wheel silently above. His soldiers disperse, returning to lands far from the empire's heart, carrying with them memories of a man who had walked among them, shared their hardships, and led them into the unknown. They tell his story by firelight, to children and grandchildren, and those children carry it onward still. In the end, Alexander's empire did not endure whole, but his vision did. He left behind not walls or thrones, but ideas, that the world was wider than men had believed, that cultures could meet and blend, that courage could carry one beyond the edge of the map. His flame burned brief, but its light cast long shadows. And so, as the night deepens and the story closes, we leave Alexander not in the dust of battle, nor in the silence of his chamber, but in the echo of his dream. A young man, born in Macedon beneath omens of fire, who rode farther than any before him, who carried with him the verses of Homer and the hunger of a restless heart. The lion's flame has faded, but its warmth lingers still. Now, let your own eyes grow heavy, your breath steady, your heart calm. The story of Alexander is done, but the night carries on, soft and timeless. May sleep take you gently, and may your dreams, like his, carry you toward horizons yet unseen.